In the winter of 1887, Montana Territory was a harsh place where fortunes were made and lost overnight. Silas McCrae had already made his fortune through railroad deals that left communities destroyed and men dead. Now he lived alone on a sprawling ranch, the wealthiest man for 300 miles, haunted by the empire he'd built on blood money. On one bitter February night, he discovered something that would change everything. A young woman collapsed in the snow outside his barn, pregnant and barely breathing. Clara Dawson was no ordinary frontier woman. She was a schoolteacher turned fugitive, carrying secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. What Silas didn't know was that saving her life would force him to confront his own past, and that their unlikely bond would spark a movement that changed American law forever. But could a man who'd spent decades destroying lives learn to build something worth saving? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly under a pewter sky, its vastness broken only by the dark line of the Rockies rising like ancient sentinels against the horizon. Snow had fallen steadily for 3 days, transforming the landscape into a crystalline wilderness where only the hardiest souls dared to venture. Silas McCrae stood at the window of his ranch house, a structure that commanded respect even in this untamed land. Built from logs, hewn by his own hands and those of men whose loyalty money had bought, the house sprawled across a natural rise, its stone chimneys sending dark columns of smoke into the frigid air. At 43, Silas carried himself with the bearing of a man who had learned that power was the only currency that mattered on the frontier. His reflection in the frosted glass showed a face carved by hard decisions and harder winters. Premature silver threaded through dark hair that he kept trimmed shorter than fashion dictated, and his eyes, a pale blue that reminded men of winter storms, had seen too much of what greed could accomplish. The expensive suit he wore, tailored in San Francisco and shipped by rail to the nearest depot, marked him as different from the ranchers and prospectors who scratched out livings in the territory's unforgiving soil. Behind him, the great room spoke of wealth accumulated through means most men preferred not to discuss. Persian rugs covered polished wood floors, and leather-bound volumes filled shelves between artifacts collected during his travels to secure railroad rights of way. A fire crackled in a stone hearth large enough to roast a whole steer, its warmth a luxury few could afford when wood had to be hauled 20 miles through treacherous mountain passes. The sound of boots on the front porch broke his reverie. Thomas Henley, his foreman and one of the few men Silas trusted completely, stamped snow from his feet before entering. Thomas had ridden with Silas during the railroad wars, had seen him make decisions that would haunt lesser men, and had never once questioned the orders that made them both wealthy beyond their wildest frontier dreams. "Storm's breaking," Thomas announced, unwinding a wool scarf from his weathered neck. At 51, Thomas bore the marks of a life spent outdoors, deep lines around his eyes from squinting against sun and snow, hands scarred from rope burns and knife cuts, shoulders permanently bent from years of hard labor. But we lost two. Head near the north pasture, wolves most likely. Found tracks leading toward the timberline. Silas nodded, his attention still partially focused on the endless white expanse beyond his window. Send Murphy and the Johnson boy out after them. Tell them to take the Winchester repeaters and enough ammunition to make the pack think twice about returning. Already done. Thomas moved to the fire, extending his hands toward the flames. There's something else, though. Martinez rode in from town yesterday evening. Says there's been talk about federal marshals asking questions about the Clearwater incident. The Clearwater incident. 3 words that could unravel everything Silas had built in the territory. 2 years ago, when the Northern Pacific Railroad needed to secure passage through a valley controlled by homesteaders, Silas had negotiated what company records called a peaceful relocation. The reality had been far less peaceful, involving hired guns, burned cabins, and families driven into the wilderness with winter approaching. 12 people had died, including children too young to understand why their homes were being destroyed. Silas kept a collection of railroad survey maps in his study, rolled documents that showed the planned routes through territories that were once home to thriving communities. Each red line marked a path of progress that had required the removal of inconvenient obstacles, usually people who had the misfortune of owning land that railroad companies coveted. The maps represented more than geographical planning. They were a visual record of his transformation from an idealistic young surveyor to a man who could calculate human displacement with the same precision he once applied to measuring elevation changes. "What kind of questions?" Silas asked, his voice betraying nothing of the calculation racing through his mind. "The kind that suggests someone's been talking. Martinez heard them asking about property transfers, about who handled the negotiations with the homesteaders. Your name came up more than once." Silas turned from the window, his pale eyes meeting Thomas's steady gaze. They had discussed this possibility many times over the past 2 years, had prepared for the day when his past would catch up with the carefully constructed life he had built in the territory. The railroad money had bought him land, influence, and a reputation as a man not to be crossed, but it couldn't purchase absolution for the blood on his hands. "How much time do we have?" "Hard to say. The marshals were headed north when Martinez saw them, but that doesn't mean they won't double back. Could be days, could be weeks, or they could already be watching the ranch." Silas moved to his desk, a massive piece of furniture carved from a single oak tree that had been felled to make way for railroad tracks. Inside the bottom drawer, wrapped in oiled leather, lay documents that could either save his life or seal his fate. Legal papers, property deeds, and most importantly, sworn statements from witnesses to events that official records claimed never happened. "Thomas, I want you to take the papers to Denver. Find Senator Morrison's office and tell him it's time to call in that favor he owes me. If federal marshals want to investigate Clearwater, they'll need to explain why they're questioning legal, territorial business conducted with full governmental approval." Thomas nodded, understanding immediately. Senator Morrison had profited handsomely from railroad expansion, his political career built on the foundation of Western development that men like Silas made possible. The senator owed his current position to campaign contributions that had arrived in carefully laundered installments, each payment representing another mile of track laid through territories that had been pacified by Silas's negotiations. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Murphy, one of the ranch hands, stood on the threshold with snow still clinging to his coat and hat. His face, normally ruddy from exposure to mountain weather, had gone pale in the lamplight. "Mr. McCrae, sir," Murphy began, his voice tight with urgency. "You need to come see this. Found something by the barn that ain't natural." Silas and Thomas exchanged glances. In their experience, things that ain't natural usually meant trouble of the human variety. Silas reached for his gun belt, checking that his Colt 45 was properly seated in its holster before following Murphy into the storm. The wind hit them like a physical blow as they stepped outside, driving snow horizontally across the yard with enough force to sting exposed skin. Silas pulled his coat tighter and lowered his head against the gale, following Murphy's lantern toward the barn. The structure loomed out of the darkness like a ship in a white sea, its weathered boards creaking under the assault of wind and ice. "Over here," Murphy called, leading them around the barn's eastern corner, where the building provided some shelter from the worst of the storm. "Found her about an hour ago when I was checking the stock." The lantern light revealed a figure huddled against the barn wall, so still that Silas's first thought was that they had discovered a frozen corpse. But then he saw the shallow rise and fall of breathing beneath a threadbare coat and realized they were looking at a woman clinging to life by the thinnest of margins. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair that had escaped from beneath a worn bonnet to frame a face that spoke of intelligence and determination, even in unconsciousness. Her clothes, though of good quality, were travel-stained and torn in places that suggested a hasty flight through rough country. Most telling of all was the obvious curve of her belly beneath the inadequate protection of her coat. She was with child, well along in her pregnancy. "Sweet Lord," Thomas breathed, kneeling beside the woman to check for signs of life. "She's burning up with fever, but her hands are like ice. How long has she been out here?" "Can't say for certain," Murphy replied. "Tracks are mostly filled in by the snow, but I'd guess she's been here since before dawn, maybe longer." Silas crouched down and gently lifted the woman's chin, studying her face in the lantern light. There was something about her features that suggested breeding and education. This was no common frontier woman driven to desperation by circumstances beyond her control. Her hands, though chapped and raw from exposure, bore the calluses of someone accustomed to holding a pen rather than a plough. A teacher, perhaps, or the daughter of a merchant family. "Thomas, get some blankets from the house. Murphy, you help me carry her inside. Carefully, we don't know what condition she's in beyond what we can see." As they lifted her, something fell from her grasp onto the snow. Silas retrieved it by lantern light, a leather satchel, well made but battered from hard travel. The clasp had broken, and several papers had scattered in the wind before he could gather them. What he managed to collect made his blood run cold. The first document was a teaching certificate issued by the Territorial Education Board to one Clara Dawson. The second was a warrant for her arrest, signed by Judge Marcus Harrison of the Territorial Court, charging her with sedition, conspiracy against territorial authority, and theft of government documents. The third, written in a careful feminine hand, appeared to be a letter addressed to the territorial governor, detailing what could only be described as systematic corruption within the territorial judicial system. Silas stuffed the papers back into the satchel and followed Thomas and Murphy into the house, his mind racing with implications. Clara Dawson was not simply a woman in distress. She was a fugitive, carrying evidence that could destroy some of the most powerful men in the territory. And by bringing her into his home, Silas had just made himself either her protector or an accessory to whatever crimes had driven her into the wilderness. In the warmth of the great room, Clara Dawson's condition became more apparent. Her skin had the waxy pallor of someone pushed beyond physical endurance, and her breathing was shallow and irregular. Thomas's wife, Martha, summoned from their cabin behind the main house, took charge with the practical efficiency of a woman who had delivered babies and tended the wounded on the frontier for 30 years. "She needs warmth, but not too fast," Martha instructed, directing the men to place Clara on the divan near the fire. "Thomas, fetch my medical bag and some clean towels. Murphy, put water on to boil. Mr. McCrae, I'll need you to help me get her out of these wet clothes before she catches her death." As they worked to strip away Clara's sodden garments and wrap her in warm blankets, Silas found himself studying her face with an attention that went beyond medical necessity. Even unconscious and ravaged by exposure, she possessed a quality that spoke of inner strength and moral conviction. This was a woman who had made hard choices and lived with the consequences, someone who understood the weight of principle in a world where expedience usually prevailed. The satchel lay on his desk like an accusation, its contents representing a level of danger that Silas had hoped to avoid in his carefully constructed life of isolation. But as he watched Martha tend to Clara Dawson with gentle competence, he realized that his days of avoiding consequences were rapidly coming to an end. The storm continued to rage outside, trapping them all in a web of circumstances that would force Silas to confront everything he had spent the last 5 years trying to forget. Clara Dawson had brought more than just her own troubles to his door. She had brought a reckoning that would test every assumption he had made about the kind of man he had chosen to become. Clara Dawson's eyes opened 3 hours before dawn on the second day, focusing with difficulty on the unfamiliar ceiling above her. The fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving her weak but lucid enough to recognize that she was no longer dying in the snow. The warmth surrounding her felt like a luxury she had almost forgotten existed, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply breathe without the terror that had driven her across 200 miles of wilderness. Memory returned in fragments. The desperate flight from Helena, the growing certainty that Judge Harrison's men were closing in, the awful realization that her pregnancy had progressed too far for the kind of travel that survival demanded. She remembered the storm catching her just as she reached what appeared to be a prosperous ranch, remembered thinking that she would rather die in the open than surrender to the corrupt officials who wanted her silenced forever. "You're awake." The voice belonged to a woman, gentle but efficient in the way of frontier wives who had learned to assess situations quickly. Clara turned her head to see a silver-haired woman in her 50s rising from a chair beside the divan. "I'm Martha. Henley, you're safe here for now." "Where?" Clara's voice came out as a croak, and Martha immediately offered her water from a ceramic cup. "The McCrae Ranch, about 40 miles southwest of Helena. My husband Thomas found you half frozen against the barn wall yesterday evening. Another hour, and we'd have been burying you instead of nursing you back to health." The name McCrae sent ice through Clara's veins, despite the warmth of the blankets. She knew that name, had heard it spoken in whispers in the territorial capital. When men discussed the railroad's expansion and the violence that seemed to follow in its wake, Silas McCrae was a legend of sorts. The man who made the impossible possible for the Northern Pacific, who could clear any obstacle from the path of progress, regardless of how many people might be living on the land the railroad needed. "I have to leave." Clara struggled to sit up, but her body betrayed her with weakness that made even that simple movement exhausting. "I can't. You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into by helping me." "I understand more than you might think." The new voice belonged to a man, and Clara looked up to see someone who matched every description she had ever heard of Silas McCrae. Tall and lean, with prematurely silver hair and eyes the color of winter ice, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. But there was something else in his expression, a weariness that spoke of burdens carried for too long. "Mr. McCrae," Clara's voice was steady despite her fear. "I know who you are. I know what you've done. And I know that harboring me will bring you the kind of trouble you've spent years avoiding." Silas moved to the fireplace, his back to her as he spoke. "I've read your papers, Miss Dawson. Your warrant, your teaching certificate, and what appears to be a rather detailed letter to Governor Potts describing systematic corruption in the territorial courts. Particularly interesting reading, especially the parts about Judge Harrison's creative interpretation of land ownership laws." Clara's heart sank. If Silas McCrae had read her evidence against Judge Harrison, then her fate was sealed. McCrae had profited enormously from the same corrupt system that Harrison represented. There was no reason for him to protect a woman whose testimony could unravel the entire network of bribes and illegal land transfers that had made both men wealthy. "Then you know why I can't stay here," she said quietly. "Judge Harrison will stop at nothing to silence me. If his men find me here, they'll kill me and anyone who helped me. I won't have innocent blood on my hands." Silas turned to face her, and Clara was surprised by the expression she saw there. Instead of the cold calculation she had expected, his face showed something that might have been regret, even shame. "Tell me about Judge Harrison," he said. "Tell me how a schoolteacher came to possess evidence that could destroy one of the most powerful men in the territory." Clara studied his face for a long moment, trying to read the motivation behind the question. Finally, she began to speak, her voice growing stronger as she told her story. She had been teaching in Helena for 3 years, she explained, boarding with the Reverend Morrison and his wife in exchange for tutoring their children in advanced mathematics and literature. It was a good life, better than she had dared hope for when she arrived in the territory with nothing but her teaching certificate and the determination to make something of herself in the West. The trouble began when one of her students, 12-year-old Annie Kowalski, stopped coming to school. When Clara visited the family's small farm to check on the girl, she found the Kowalskis packing their belongings with the desperate haste of people fleeing for their lives. "Judge Harrison says we got no legal claim to this land," Mr. Kowalski had explained, his English thick with the accent of his native Poland. "Says the papers we got from the land office ain't worth nothing, that we've been squatting here for 2 years without paying proper fees. Says if we don't get out by week's end, he'll have the sheriff come with guns." Clara had accompanied the family to town, thinking that surely there had been some mistake. The Kowalskis had purchased their 160 acres through the proper territorial channels, had paid their fees and filed all the required paperwork. But when they appeared before Judge Harrison with their documents, the judge had declared them forgeries and ordered the family to vacate immediately. "That's when I started paying attention to other cases," Clara continued, her voice hardening with remembered anger. The Kowalskis weren't the only family losing their land to sudden discoveries of paperwork irregularities. Over the course of 6 months, Judge Harrison invalidated the claims of more than 30 families, all of them owners of properties that happened to lie directly in the path of proposed railroad expansion. She had begun keeping careful records, documenting each case and noting the patterns that emerged. Properties seized by the court were immediately resold to shell companies that traced back to railroad interests. Families who protested too vigorously often found themselves facing criminal charges on trumped-up evidence. And through it all, Judge Harrison grew visibly wealthier, building a mansion on the outskirts of Helena and acquiring mining interests that should have been well beyond the means of a territorial judge. "I thought if I could gather enough evidence, I could present it to Governor Potts, and he would remove Harrison from the bench," Clara said. "I was naive enough to believe that justice would prevail if the truth was simply brought to light." Silas's expression had grown increasingly grim as Clara spoke. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. "You discovered more than you realized," he said finally. "Judge Harrison wasn't acting alone. The network you uncovered extends far beyond the territorial courts. It includes railroad executives, federal appointees, and men whose influence reaches all the way to Washington. You weren't just threatening one corrupt judge, Miss Dawson. You were threatening an entire system of organized theft that has stolen millions of acres and displaced thousands of families." "How do you know this?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because I was part of it." Silas met her eyes directly, his face showing no attempt to excuse or minimize his role. "For 5 years, I served as the railroad's negotiator for difficult land acquisitions. When families wouldn't sell voluntarily, when territorial law stood in the way of expansion, when inconvenient obstacles needed to be removed, that's when they called on me. I told myself I was building the future, bringing civilization to the wilderness, but what I was really doing was clearing human beings out of the path of corporate greed." Clara studied his face, seeing something there that she hadn't expected, genuine remorse mixed with a kind of weary determination. "The night you fled Helena," Silas continued, "Judge Harrison sent word through his usual channels that a schoolteacher had stolen sensitive documents and needed to be eliminated quietly. The bounty on your head is $5,000, Miss Dawson, enough to buy the loyalty of every gun for hire between here and California. But what Harrison doesn't know is that his message was intercepted by someone who has been watching his activities with great interest. You, me." Silas moved to his desk and withdrew a folder thick with papers. "I've been documenting Harrison's activities for the past 6 months, building my own case against the network I once served. Your evidence fills in gaps I couldn't have bridged on my own. Together, what we have could bring down not just Harrison, but the entire corrupt system that made his crimes possible. Clara felt a surge of hope mixed with disbelief. Why? Why would you turn against people who made you wealthy? Why would you risk everything to help me? Silas was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had carried too many regrets for too many years. Because I've seen what we built, Miss Dawson. I've walked through the ruins of communities that were destroyed to make way for progress. I've looked into the eyes of children whose parents died because they stood in the way of railroad expansion. And I've come to understand that no amount of wealth can buy back a man's soul once he's sold it. He moved to the window, looking out. At the snow-covered landscape where dawn was beginning to break grey and cold over the mountains. You came here by accident, driven by desperation and a winter storm. But maybe some accidents are meant to happen. Maybe sometimes the right people find each other at exactly the moment when they're both ready to do something that matters. Clara felt tears she had held back for weeks finally spill over. For the first time since she had discovered the truth about Judge Harrison's corruption, she was not alone. For the first time since she had fled into the wilderness carrying evidence that powerful men would kill to suppress, she had found an ally with the resources and knowledge to help her fight back. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, Clara understood that accepting Silas McCrae's protection meant accepting a level of danger that would test every principle she held dear. The man offering to help her was the same man who had destroyed dozens of communities in service to the railroad's expansion. Could she trust someone whose hands were stained with the blood of innocents? Could she work with a man whose past was everything she had devoted her life to opposing? The answer, she realized, might determine not just her own survival, but the fate of every family that would face Judge Harrison's corrupt court in the future. The morning brought a crystalline clarity to the world outside. The storm having passed to leave behind a landscape transformed into something that seemed almost ethereal in its beauty. Clara stood at the window of what she had learned was Silas's study, watching the sun paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. For a moment, she could almost forget the danger that had driven her here, could almost pretend that she was simply a guest, admiring the view from a prosperous ranch. Martha had insisted she rest for another day before attempting to discuss anything of consequence. But Clara's mind refused to be still. During the long hours of recovery, she had wrestled with questions that seemed to have no easy answers. How could she reconcile the man who had shown her such kindness with the stories she had heard about Silas McCrae's ruthless efficiency in clearing obstacles from the railroad's path? How could she work with someone whose wealth had been built on the suffering of families like the Kowalskis? You're thinking too hard. Silas's voice came from behind her, and Clara turned to see him entering the study with 2 cups of coffee, steam rising from the dark liquid like incense in a church. Martha says that's a particular failing of educated women, the tendency to think themselves into paralysis when action is what's needed. And what action would you recommend? Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic and inhaling the rich aroma. Should I simply forget everything I know about your past and trust that a man who destroyed communities for profit has suddenly developed a conscience? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Clara watched Silas's face carefully for his reaction. Instead of anger or defensiveness, she saw something that might have been relief, as if he had been waiting for her to voice the doubts that must have been obvious in her manner. "No," he said simply. "You shouldn't forget, and you shouldn't trust easily. Trust should be earned, Miss Dawson, and I'm well aware that my past actions have created a debt that can't be paid with words alone." He moved to a bookshelf and withdrew a small, worn object that Clara recognized as a family Bible. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the gilt lettering had faded until it was barely visible, but it had clearly been treasured by someone who had turned to its pages often in times of difficulty. "This belonged to my mother," Silas said, opening the Bible to reveal pressed flowers scattered between the pages, wildflowers that must have been gathered decades ago and preserved like memories between the lines of Scripture. "She came west with my father in 1852, believing they were going to build something good in the wilderness. She kept this Bible through 3 moves, 2 harsh winters, and the kind of poverty that breaks most people's spirits. Every Sunday, she would read from it to anyone who would listen, convinced that faith and hard work would eventually triumph over hardship." Clara studied the pressed flowers, noting how carefully they had been arranged, how tenderly they had been preserved. What happened to her? She died believing in the goodness of the world she was helping to create. Silas closed the Bible gently, his fingers tracing the worn cover. She never lived to see what her son became in service to that creation. She never knew that the railroad expansion she supported would require the destruction of communities, just like the one she had worked so hard to build. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Clara found herself seeing him not as the legendary figure whose name was whispered in fear throughout the territory, but as a man who had lost his way and was trying to find his path back to something resembling honor. "I can't give you easy answers about trusting me," Silas continued. "All I can tell you is that I've seen enough destruction to last several lifetimes, and I'd like to spend whatever years I have left building something instead of tearing things down. Your fight against Judge Harrison's corruption, that's the kind of building I want to be part of." Clara sipped her coffee slowly, studying his face over the rim of her cup. "You understand that working with me means turning against people who consider you a valuable asset. The railroad executives, the territorial officials, the federal appointees, they won't simply accept that you've had a change of heart. They'll see you as a traitor, and they'll respond accordingly. Let them." There was steel in Silas's voice. Now, the kind of determination that had made him legendary among railroad negotiators. "I've been preparing for this confrontation for months, Miss Dawson. I have documents that detail every illegal land seizure, every bribe paid to territorial officials, every family displaced by fraudulent court orders. What I've lacked is someone with the moral authority to present that evidence in a way that demands justice, rather than simply revenge. And you think I have that authority? I think you have something far more valuable. You have clean hands and a clear conscience. When you speak about the families who lost their homes to Harrison's corruption, people will believe you because you have nothing to gain from their suffering. When I speak about the same crimes, people will wonder what my angle is, what I hope to accomplish by betraying my former associates." Clara moved to the window again, watching a hawk circle high above the snow-covered valley. The bird moved with patient precision, waiting for the right moment to strike, and she found herself thinking about timing and opportunity. How long could she remain hidden at the ranch before Harrison's men tracked her down? How long before her pregnancy progressed to the point where travel became impossible? How long before the window for action closed completely? "There's something you need to understand about my situation," she said without turning from the window. "I'm not just a fugitive carrying inconvenient evidence. I'm a woman carrying a child whose father died because he threatened to expose the same corruption I've been documenting." Silas was silent for a long moment, and when Clara finally turned to face him, she saw understanding dawning in his pale eyes. "The child's father was involved in your investigation?" "David Hartwell was a clerk in the Territorial Land Office," Clara said, surprised by how much it still hurt to speak his name. "He was the one who first noticed the pattern of fraudulent transfers, who helped me understand how Harrison was manipulating property records to benefit railroad interests. We had planned to marry in the spring. What happened to him? Official cause of death was a riding accident, thrown from his horse during a winter storm and found 3 days later with a broken neck. But David was one of the finest horsemen in the territory. He could ride through conditions that would challenge a cavalry officer." Clara's voice hardened with remembered grief and rage. The accident happened 2 days after he told me he had found evidence that could implicate federal officials in the land fraud scheme. Evidence that could reach all the way to Washington. And you believe Harrison had him killed. I know Harrison had him killed. Just like I know that my child will grow up without a father because powerful men decided that David's conscience made him too dangerous to live. Clara placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the baby move restlessly, as if responding to her emotional state. So when you ask me to trust you, Mr. McCrae, understand that I'm not just risking my own life. I'm risking the life of an unborn child whose father died fighting the same corruption you once served. The weight of her words settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. Silas set down his coffee cup and moved to his desk, withdrawing a key from his vest pocket and unlocking the bottom drawer. From inside, he removed a small wooden box that had clearly been crafted with care, its surface polished smooth by handling. "This was my father's," he said, opening the box to reveal a gold pocket watch with an intricate inscription on the inside cover. "He gave it to me when I left home to work for the railroad, told me that a man's worth could be measured by how he spent his time. I used to check this watch dozens of times a day when I was negotiating with homesteaders, calculating how quickly I could complete each relocation and move on to the next assignment." He held the watch out to Clara, and she could see that the inscription read, "To William McCrae, with faith in the man you will become. Your loving father, 1851. "I haven't opened this watch in 2 years, Silas said quietly. Every time I looked at it, I could feel my father's disappointment in the man I had actually become. But if we're going to work together, if we're going to honor your David's memory by finishing what he started, then maybe it's time I started, measuring my worth by something other than how efficiently I could destroy other people's lives." Clara studied the watch, noting the craftsmanship and the love that had clearly gone into its selection. This was a gift from a parent who believed in his child's potential for good, a tangible reminder of the man Silas had been meant to become. "If I agree to work with you," she said carefully, "I need your word that we'll do this honorably. No bribes, no intimidation, no violence unless we're defending ourselves. The evidence speaks for itself. We don't need to employ the methods that Harrison and his associates use. You have my word." Silas closed the watch and slipped it into his vest pocket. "And you have my promise that I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to become the man my father believed I could be." Outside, the sound of horses approaching broke the morning silence. Thomas appeared in the doorway of the study, his face grim with news that Clara suspected would shatter the temporary peace they had found in their tentative alliance. "Riders coming up the valley road," Thomas announced. 6 men, heavily armed, and they're not here for a social call. Someone's been asking questions in town about a pregnant woman traveling alone, and it looks like they've gotten answers they didn't like. The transformation in Silas was immediate and complete. Gone was the reflective man who had been sharing family memories and personal regrets. In his place stood someone Clara recognized from the stories she had heard about the railroad's most effective negotiator. His movements became economical and precise, his voice taking on the kind of authority that made men obey without question. "Thomas, how much time do we have?" Silas moved to a gun cabinet, withdrawing a Winchester rifle and checking its action with practiced efficiency. 10 minutes, maybe 15 if they're being cautious about approaching the house. "More than enough." Silas turned to Clara, his pale eyes now focused with deadly intensity. "Miss Dawson, I need you to gather your papers and anything else you can't afford to lose. Martha will take you to the root cellar behind the kitchen. It's connected to a tunnel that leads to the barn. If things go badly, Thomas will get you to the horses and you'll ride for the territorial capital. I'm not running anymore." Clara's voice carried a conviction that surprised even her. "These men have chased me across half the territory, murdered, the father of my child, and destroyed the lives of dozens of innocent families. I'm tired of being afraid." "Fear is what's kept you alive this long," Silas replied, but his tone held respect rather than condescension. "There's no shame in tactical retreat when the odds are against you. The odds have been against me since the day I decided to oppose Judge Harrison's corruption. If I keep running, I'll be running for the rest of my life, however long that might be." Clara moved to the window, studying the approaching riders with the same careful attention Silas had shown when examining his rifle. "Besides, you'll need someone who can testify to what happened here. If these men kill you, the evidence dies with you." Thomas appeared in the doorway, his own rifle in hand and his face set in the grim lines of a man preparing for violence. "They've stopped at the edge of the yard. Looks like they're planning their approach." Silas joined Clara at the window, and together they watched the 6 horsemen spread out in a loose semicircle around the house. Even at a distance, Clara could see that these were not ordinary bounty hunters or territorial lawmen. They moved with military precision, their weapons held with the casual competence of men who killed for a living. "Professional assassins," Silas said quietly, confirming Clara's assessment. "Harrison's not taking any chances with loose ends." "You recognize them?" "I recognize the type. The railroad used men like these when negotiation failed and intimidation wasn't enough." Silas's voice carried the weight of old guilt and fresh determination. "I used to think there was a difference between what I did and what men like these do. I told myself that I was serving a greater purpose, that the violence was necessary for progress. But looking at them now, I see myself as I really was." One of the riders dismounted and began walking toward the house, his hands visible but his rifle held in a position that would allow him to bring it to bear in seconds. He was a lean man, with the kind of scarred face that spoke of a life spent in violent occupations, and his approach showed the confidence of someone who had never failed to complete an assignment. "That's Jack Morrison," Thomas said from the doorway. "Used to work for the Pinkertons before he went freelance. Word is, he's never brought back a bounty alive if the client preferred them dead." Then Judge Harrison's instructions were clear enough. Silas checked his revolver and moved toward the front door. "Thomas, you and Martha get Miss Dawson to the tunnel. I'll handle the negotiations." "No." Clara's voice stopped him before he could reach the door. "If you go out there alone, you'll be walking into an execution. Morrison and his men didn't come here to negotiate. They came here to eliminate witnesses." Before Silas could respond, Morrison's voice carried clearly across the yard, amplified by the crisp mountain air and the unnatural silence that seemed to precede violence. "McCrae, we know you're in there, and we know you've got something that belongs to Judge Harrison. Send out the woman, and we'll make this quick and clean. Try to be a hero, and we'll burn the house down around you." Silas moved to the window beside the front door, positioning himself where he could see Morrison while remaining largely concealed. "And what guarantee do I have that you'll honor that arrangement?" "You've got my word as a professional," Morrison called back, and Clara could hear amusement in his voice. "The judge wants the woman and any papers she might be carrying. He doesn't necessarily care about witnesses, as long as they understand the value of keeping quiet about things that don't concern them." It was a lie, and Clara suspected that everyone involved knew it. Men like Morrison didn't leave witnesses to professional assassinations, especially when those witnesses were as well connected and potentially dangerous as Silas McCrae. But the charade of negotiation served a purpose. It allowed Morrison to position his men while Silas was distracted by false hope. "I need a minute to consider your offer," Silas called back, buying time while he signaled to Thomas. Years of working together had created a communication that required no words, and Clara watched Thomas nod and disappear toward the back of the house. "You've got 1 minute," Morrison replied. "Then we start shooting, and we don't stop until everyone in that house is dead." Silas turned to Clara, his expression intense, but no longer desperate. "I'm going to make you an offer, and I need you to consider it carefully. There's a way out of this that doesn't involve bloodshed, but it requires a level of trust that I haven't earned yet. What kind of offer? I give myself up to Morrison, along with a set of documents that will satisfy Harrison's immediate concerns. You and the real evidence escape through the tunnel and make your way to Denver, where Senator Morrison, no relation to our friend outside, can provide federal protection while you present your case. Clara stared at him in disbelief. You're talking about sacrificing yourself to save me. That's not an alliance. That's suicide. It's strategy. Silas moved to his desk and withdrew a thick folder that Clara hadn't seen before. These documents contain enough real information to convince Harrison that he's eliminated the threat, but not enough to implicate anyone beyond the judge himself. By the time Harrison realizes he's been deceived, you'll be under federal protection, and the real evidence will be in the hands of people who can act on it. And you'll be dead, maybe. Or maybe I'll convince Morrison that I'm more valuable alive than dead. I still have connections throughout the territory, Miss Dawson. There are powerful men who owe me favors, and Morrison's smart enough to recognize that my continued good health might be worth more than whatever Harrison is paying him. The plan was elaborate, dangerous, and probably doomed to failure, but Clara could see the logic in it. More importantly, she could see that Silas had been preparing for this moment long before she arrived at his ranch. The documents he held, the tunnel Thomas was presumably opening, the careful positioning of resources. This was the work of a man who had been planning his own redemption for months. There's something else, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that wouldn't carry beyond the room. If I don't survive this, I want you to know that helping you has been the first worthwhile thing I've done in 5 years. Whatever happens to me, finishing what you and David started is more important than my survival. Before Clara could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway with a heavy coat and a traveling bag. "Tunnel's open," she said quietly. "Horses are saddled and waiting in the barn. If you're going to do this, you need to go now." Clara looked from Martha to Silas, seeing in both faces the kind of determination that came from having made peace with necessary sacrifices. These people, virtual strangers a day ago, were preparing to risk everything to help her complete a mission that might cost them their lives. But as she prepared to follow Martha toward what might be her only chance of escape, Clara realized that something fundamental had changed in her understanding of the situation. She was no longer simply a fugitive carrying evidence of corruption. She had become part of something larger, a group of people who had decided that justice was worth dying for, and that the future was more important than individual survival. The sound of boots on the front porch announced that Morrison's patience had reached its limit. In moments, the careful negotiations would end, and the violence would begin. Clara had seconds to decide whether to accept Silas's sacrifice or to find another way, a way that might save them all or might doom them all, but would at least ensure that they faced their fate together. Outside, Morrison's voice carried a new edge of impatience. "Time's up, McCrae. Send out the woman, or we're coming in shooting." Clara made her choice. "There's a third option," Clara said, her voice steady despite the thunder of her heartbeat. "We fight them together, but not the way they expect." Silas paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "What do you mean?" "Morrison is expecting either surrender or a siege. He's not expecting a woman in my condition to be anything other than a liability." Clara moved to the gun cabinet, surprised by her own calm, as she selected a small revolver that would be manageable despite her pregnancy. "But I know things about Judge Harrison's operation that could be more valuable than bullets." "This isn't a courtroom debate, Miss Dawson. These men kill for a living, and I've been documenting their employers for months." Clara checked the revolver's cylinder, grateful for the shooting lessons her father had insisted upon during her childhood in Kansas. "Morrison works for Harrison, but Harrison works for the railroad interests. If I can convince Morrison that Harrison has been cheating him and them out of substantial payments, we might be able to turn this situation to our advantage." Thomas reappeared from the back of the house, carrying what Clara recognized as a Civil War medal pinned to a faded blue ribbon. The bronze disc caught the light as he moved, and she could see the eagle and stars that marked it as a decoration for valor. This was clearly a treasured possession, something that represented the best of what Thomas had been before the railroad wars had complicated his sense of honor. "Martha's in position by the tunnel," Thomas reported, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced enemy fire before. "But she thinks Miss Dawson's idea has merit. Martha spent 20 years married to a cavalry sergeant before she married me. She knows something about turning enemies against each other." Silas studied Clara's face with the same intensity he had shown when examining his rifle. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we tell Morrison the truth, or enough of it to make him question his employer's honesty." Clara moved to Silas's desk and spread out several of the documents she had gathered during her investigation. "Look at these payment records from Harrison's court. The judge has been billing the railroad for services that were never rendered, collecting fees for land transfers that were handled by other territorial officials, even charging for the elimination of witnesses who were never actually eliminated. You're saying Harrison has been embezzling from his own criminal enterprise?" "I'm saying Harrison has been treating the railroad's money as his personal treasury, and men like Morrison have been doing the dangerous work, while Harrison keeps the lion's share of the profits." Clara pointed to a series of entries in Harrison's careful handwriting. According to these records, Morrison was paid $200 for eliminating David Hartwell, but the railroad authorized payment of $1,000 for that particular assignment. Silas whistled softly. $800 is enough to buy a small ranch in this territory. If Morrison knew Harrison was keeping that much for himself. Exactly. And this is just one example. I've found similar discrepancies in dozens of transactions over the past 2 years. Clara felt a grim satisfaction as she saw understanding dawn in Silas's eyes. Morrison thinks he's working for the most powerful corruption network in the territory. What he doesn't know is that he's actually working for a petty embezzler who's been cheating everyone involved. The sound of footsteps on the porch indicated that Morrison's patience was reaching its limit, but Clara pressed on with her explanation. "If we can convince Morrison that Harrison has been stealing from the railroad, and from him, we might be able to turn him against his employer. At the very least, we can create enough doubt to buy ourselves time to escape. And if Morrison doesn't believe you, then we'll be no worse off than we are now." Clara tucked the revolver into her coat pocket, feeling its weight as both burden and reassurance. "But if he does believe me, we might just convince him that Judge Harrison is a bigger problem than we are." Thomas moved to the window, his medal catching the light as he assessed the positions of Morrison's men. "They're getting restless out there. Morrison's going to make his move soon, whether we're ready or not." Silas made his decision with the kind of swift calculation that had made him legendary among railroad negotiators. "We'll try your plan, Miss Dawson, but with modifications. Thomas, you and Martha create a distraction at the back of the house. Nothing dramatic, just enough noise to suggest that someone might be trying to escape through that tunnel. Miss Dawson and I will negotiate with Morrison from the front porch, where she can present her evidence in plain sight. And if Morrison decides to shoot first and ask questions later, then we'll have learned something important about the nature of honor among thieves." Silas opened the front door slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Morrison, I'm coming out to talk. The woman will be with me, along with some information that I think you'll find very interesting." The response came immediately. "Any tricks, McCrae, and we'll kill you where you stand." "No tricks," Silas called back. "Just a business proposition that might be more profitable than whatever Harrison is paying you." Clara followed Silas onto the porch, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stepped into the open, where Morrison's men could see her clearly. The morning air was sharp with the promise of more snow, and she could see her breath forming small clouds as she breathed. Around the yard, 6 rifles tracked her movement with mechanical precision. Morrison himself stood about 20 feet from the porch, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid any sudden moves. Up close, Clara could see that he was older than she had initially thought, perhaps 45, with graying hair and the kind of scars that came from a lifetime of violence. But his eyes were intelligent, and she found herself hoping that intelligence would work in their favor. "So," Morrison said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement, "the famous Clara Dawson, the schoolteacher who thinks she can bring down Judge Harrison with a handful of papers. You don't look like much of a threat to me." "Appearances can be deceiving," Clara replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Just like employment arrangements can be deceiving when one party isn't being entirely honest about compensation." Something flickered in Morrison's eyes. Interest, perhaps, or suspicion. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that Judge Harrison has been keeping secrets from you, Mr. Morrison. Expensive secrets that have cost you and your men a considerable amount of money over the past 2 years. Clara held up the documents she had brought from the house. "Would you like to know how much money Harrison has stolen from you while you've been risking your life on his behalf?" Morrison's rifle barrel dropped slightly, and Clara saw him glance toward his men with an expression that suggested wheels turning behind his scarred features. "Keep talking." "The railroad authorized payment of $1,000 for the elimination of David Hartwell last November. According to Harrison's records, you received $200 for that assignment. Where do you suppose the other $800 went?" The silence that followed was electric with tension. Clara could see Morrison calculating, remembering, perhaps thinking back over 2 years of assignments and payments that had never seemed quite as generous as they should have been. "You're lying," Morrison said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm a schoolteacher, Mr. Morrison. I know how to add and subtract." Clara held the documents higher, making sure Morrison could see Harrison's careful handwriting. "I have records here of 15 different assignments where the railroad authorized significantly more money than you actually received. In total, Judge Harrison has embezzled more than $12,000 that should have been distributed among you and your men. $12,000. Clara watched the figure sink in, saw Morrison's face change as he began to understand the magnitude of Harrison's betrayal. $12,000 was enough to buy a small town in the territory, enough to set up every man in Morrison's crew with a legitimate business and a comfortable life. Why should I believe a fugitive who's trying to save her own skin? Because, Silas interjected, she has Harrison's account books, and you have the intelligence to recognize truth when you hear it. More importantly, because the real question isn't whether you believe her, it's whether you can afford not to investigate her claims." Morrison was silent for a long moment, his rifle now pointed at the ground as he considered the implications of what Clara had revealed. Around the yard, his men waited for orders, but Clara could see uncertainty in their postures now, could sense that the absolute confidence of their approach had been shaken by doubt. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice carried a new edge of anger that was directed not at his intended targets, but at the man who had hired him. "Show me those account books." Morrison approached the porch with the careful steps of a man who had survived 2 decades of dangerous work by never fully trusting anyone. His rifle remained in his hands, ready but not directly threatening, while his eyes moved constantly between Clara, Silas, and the documents she held. Behind him, his men maintained their positions, but Clara could sense a subtle shift in their attention. They were listening now, not just waiting for orders to kill. "Before I look at anything," Morrison said, stopping just out of arm's reach, "I want to know why a schoolteacher would have access to Judge Harrison's private financial records." Clara had anticipated this question, had prepared for it during the long nights of planning her escape from Helena. "Because David Hartwell, the man you murdered, was my fiancé, because he worked in the Territorial Land Office and had access to payment records for court-ordered property transfers, and because he was documenting Harrison's embezzlement when you killed him." The words hung in the cold air like an accusation, and Clara watched Morrison's face carefully for any sign of remorse or recognition. What she saw instead was the professional assessment of a man calculating new variables in an equation he thought he had already solved. So this is personal for you. It became personal when you made it personal. Clara's voice carried a steel that surprised even her. But the numbers don't lie because of my feelings, Mr. Morrison. They lie because Judge Harrison has been stealing from everyone who works for him. Silas stepped forward, producing a leather portfolio that Clara recognized as one of his carefully organized business files. Miss Dawson, perhaps Mr. Morrison would be more convinced by evidence from a source. He knows to be reliable. Clara understood immediately. Silas was offering his own documentation of the corruption network, records that Morrison would recognize as authentic because they came from someone who had been part of the system. It was a calculated risk, revealing Silas's own involvement. The corruption could backfire, but it also carried the weight of insider knowledge. What's in the portfolio, McCrae? Morrison's tone suggested he was already beginning to guess. Railroad payment authorizations for territorial operations over the past 3 years, Silas replied. Every assignment, every authorized payment, every official record of money transferred from railroad accounts to territorial officials. I've been keeping detailed records because I learned early in my career that powerful men have convenient memories when it comes to financial obligations. Morrison extended his hand for the portfolio, his movements betraying none of the tension Clara was certain he must be feeling. As he opened the leather cover and began scanning the documents inside, she found herself studying his face for any sign of the reaction she was hoping to provoke. What she saw was the careful attention of a man who understood numbers and recognized patterns. Morrison might be a killer, but he was also a businessman who had built his reputation on reliable service and fair dealing within the brutal world of territorial politics. The idea that Judge Harrison had been cheating him would strike at the core of his professional identity. This payment authorization is for $1,500, Morrison said, pointing to a document dated 6 months earlier, for the removal of the Patterson family from their homestead near Great Falls. How much did Harrison pay you for that particular assignment? Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. $300, split 6 ways among my crew. Morrison's voice was carefully controlled, but Clara could hear anger building beneath the surface. Harrison said the railroad was being cheap because the assignment was simple, just a family with no political connections. According to the railroad's records, the Patterson assignment was considered high priority because of mineral rights issues, Silas said. $1,500 was authorized specifically because the railroad needed the removal handled quickly and quietly. Morrison continued reading, his face growing darker with each document he examined. Clara watched him discover assignment after assignment where the authorized payments had been 2 or 3 times what he had actually received. The pattern was unmistakable. Judge Harrison had been systematically embezzling from every operation, keeping the majority of the railroad's payments while his men risked their lives for a fraction of what they had earned. "Son of a bitch," Morrison muttered, and Clara realized she had never heard quite that level of controlled fury in 2 simple words. "That lying, thieving son of a bitch has been playing us for fools. The question now," Silas said carefully, "is what you intend to do about it." Morrison closed the portfolio and looked directly at Clara, his scarred face showing a mixture of anger and something that might have been respect. "You're asking me to turn against a man who's been paying my wages for 2 years. I'm asking you to consider that Judge Harrison has been stealing your wages for 2 years, Clara corrected, and that the real enemy isn't the people who exposed his theft. It's the man who's been robbing you while you did his dirty work." The sound of horses approaching from the direction of the main road interrupted their conversation. Morrison's head snapped up, his professional instincts immediately alert to the possibility of new threats or complications. Clara followed his gaze and saw 3 riders approaching at a gallop, their horses kicking up clouds of snow as they covered the distance to the ranch. "You expecting company, McCrae?" Morrison's rifle was back in position, ready to respond to whatever new element was entering the situation. "No," Silas replied, but Clara could see recognition in his eyes as the riders drew closer. "But I know who they are." The lead rider was a woman, Clara realized with surprise. A woman who rode with the easy competence of someone born to the saddle. Behind her came 2 men, both armed and alert, but following her lead rather than providing protection. As they approached the house, the woman raised her hand in a gesture that was clearly meant to signal peaceful intentions. "That's Judge Harrison's daughter," Silas said quietly. "Sarah Harrison. And if she's here, it means something has changed in Helena." Morrison's expression shifted from anger to calculation as he processed this new information. "What would bring the judge's daughter out to your ranch, McCrae, especially with things as tense as they are right now?" Before anyone could answer, Sarah Harrison called out across the yard, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Mr. Morrison, I need to speak with you immediately. My father is dead, and the territorial marshal is looking for you and your men in connection with his murder." The words hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Clara felt her knees go weak as the implications sank in. If Judge Harrison was dead, then everything had changed. The corruption network they had been fighting might be headless, but it also meant that new and unknown powers would be moving to fill the vacuum left by Harrison's death. Morrison lowered his rifle completely, his professional composure cracking. For the first time since he had arrived at the ranch. What happened? Sarah Harrison dismounted and approached the group, her face showing the strain of recent grief mixed with urgent purpose. She was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps 28 or 30, with intelligent eyes and the kind of determined bearing that suggested she had inherited more than just her father's name. "He was found dead in his chambers this morning," Sarah said, addressing Morrison directly. "Shot twice in the back of the head, execution style. The territorial marshal says it has all the marks of a professional killing, and your name was the first one mentioned when they started looking for suspects." "I've been here since yesterday," Morrison replied automatically. "McCrae and his people can testify to that." "Can they?" Sarah's gaze moved to include Clara and Silas in her assessment. "Because according to what I learned before riding out here, Miss Dawson is wanted for stealing evidence of my father's corruption, and Mr. McCrae is suspected of harboring a fugitive. The territorial authorities aren't likely to consider any of you reliable witnesses." Clara found her voice, despite the shock of learning that Judge Harrison was dead. "Why would you warn Morrison about the marshal's investigation? Your father's death benefits his enemies, not his employees." Sarah Harrison's smile held no warmth, but it did hold a kind of grim satisfaction. "Because, Miss Dawson, my father's death benefits me most of all. And because I have a proposition that might interest all of you. A proposition that could solve everyone's problems while ensuring that justice is actually served for once in this territory." She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with official territorial wax. "I have here a letter from the territorial governor written before my father's death, authorizing a complete investigation into judicial corruption in Helena. The governor was prepared to remove my father from the bench based on evidence that had already reached his office." Clara stared at the envelope, recognizing the potential importance of what Sarah Harrison was offering. An official investigation would legitimize everything she and David had been working toward, would provide the legal framework needed to expose the entire corruption network. "What kind of proposition?" Silas asked, his voice careful and controlled. "The kind that turns all of you from fugitives and suspected murderers into key witnesses in a territorial investigation," Sarah replied. "The kind that ensures my father's Corruption is exposed and punished, while the people responsible for his actual murder are brought to justice. Morrison studied Sarah Harrison's face with the same intensity he had shown when examining the financial records. "And what do you get out of this arrangement?" "I get to see my father's reputation destroyed and his criminal associates brought to justice," Sarah said simply. "You see, gentlemen, and Miss Dawson, I've been documenting my father's crimes for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to destroy him. His death simply means that I'll have to settle for destroying his legacy instead." The territorial land grant documents that Clara had been carrying suddenly seemed far more significant. If Sarah Harrison had been collecting her own evidence of corruption, and if the territorial governor was prepared to act on that evidence, then they might have found the ally they needed to transform their desperate situation into something approaching victory. But first, they would need to determine whether Sarah Harrison could be trusted and whether her proposal offered genuine salvation or simply a more sophisticated trap. The revelation came not through words, but through a single document that Sarah Harrison withdrew from her coat with the careful precision of someone handling dynamite. It was a leather-bound ledger, smaller than the account books Clara had been studying, but bound in expensive leather that spoke of its importance to whoever had kept it. "Before we discuss any propositions," Sarah said, her voice carrying a gravity that made everyone present focus completely on her words, "there's something you all need to understand about the scope of what we're dealing with. My father's corruption was extensive, but it was also just one small part of something much larger." She opened the ledger to a page marked with a red ribbon, revealing columns of figures written in a hand that Clara didn't recognize. The amounts were staggering, payments in the tens of thousands of dollars, dates spanning back 5 years, and most telling of all, recipient names that included some of the most powerful figures in territorial and federal government. "This is my father's insurance policy," Sarah continued. "The record he kept of every bribe paid, every favor purchased, every illegal transaction that connected his local corruption to a network that reaches all the way to Washington. He called it his retirement fund, the guarantee that powerful people would protect him because exposing his crimes would expose their own." Silas moved closer to examine the ledger, his face growing pale as he recognized names and amounts. "Senator Morrison, Territorial Governor Potts, Federal Land Commissioner Williams." "Sweet Lord, half the territorial government is listed here." "More than half," Sarah confirmed, "and it goes beyond government officials, railroad executives, mining company owners, federal judges. My father documented every corrupt transaction because he understood that knowledge was power. But he also understood that knowledge could be a death sentence if it fell into the wrong hands." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You're saying that the people responsible for your father's murder weren't acting to silence him," Sarah finished. "They were acting to obtain this ledger. My father's murder wasn't about stopping his corruption. It was about controlling the evidence of everyone else's corruption." Morrison stepped forward, his professional demeanor replaced by something approaching awe. "How many people knew about this ledger?" "Very few. My father was paranoid about security, but he wasn't paranoid." "Enough." Sarah closed the ledger and held it against her chest like a shield. 3 days ago, someone broke into his private safe. Nothing was taken, but the lock had been picked by an expert. Yesterday, he received a message demanding that he turn over all his insurance documentation or face immediate consequences. And instead of complying, Silas said slowly, he was murdered. "Which means," Clara added, her mind racing through the implications, "that whoever killed him didn't get what they were looking for. The real target wasn't Judge Harrison. It was this ledger." Sarah nodded grimly. "And now that my father is dead, every person named in these pages has a compelling interest in ensuring that this information never becomes public." We're not just dealing with territorial corruption anymore. We're dealing with people who have the power to make entire investigations disappear. The sound of horses approaching from multiple directions broke the tense silence. Morrison immediately raised his rifle, scanning the tree line for signs of the new arrivals, while his men took defensive positions around the yard. But instead of the organized approach of law enforcement or hired guns, these riders came from different directions and with different purposes. The first to arrive was Thomas, returning from what had apparently been a scouting mission. His face was grim as he dismounted and approached the group on the porch. "Federal marshals," he announced without preamble. "At least a dozen, maybe more, set up roadblocks on every route leading away from Helena. They're not just looking for Miss Dawson anymore. They're conducting what they're calling a comprehensive investigation into territorial corruption." "How comprehensive?" Silas asked, though Clara suspected he already knew the answer. "Comprehensive. Enough that they've got warrants for anyone who's ever done business with Judge Harrison. Comprehensive enough that they're offering rewards for information about missing territorial documents. And comprehensive enough that they're authorized to use whatever force necessary to recover stolen government property." Clara understood immediately. The federal government wasn't investigating corruption. It was covering it up. The marshals weren't looking for justice. They were looking for the ledger that could implicate federal officials in territorial crimes. The second group of riders approached from the north. 3 men in expensive suits riding horses that clearly belonged to people unaccustomed to frontier travel. Even from a distance, Clara could see that these were not territorial officials or federal marshals. These were the kind of men who operated in boardrooms and backrooms, who wielded power through influence rather than badges. "Railroad executives," Morrison said, recognizing something in their bearing that marked them as his ultimate employers. "Which means someone's been making phone calls to very important people." Sarah Harrison's grip tightened on the ledger. "They're not here to negotiate. They're here to ensure that this information never sees daylight, regardless of who has to die to guarantee that outcome." The third arrival was the most unexpected of all, a single rider approaching from the east at a gallop that suggested urgent news. As the figure drew closer, Clara recognized the uniform of a territorial telegraph operator, the kind of messenger who carried communications that were too sensitive for normal channels. "Message for Silas McCrae," the operator called out as he reined in his horse. "Priority communication from Denver, marked urgent and confidential." Silas accepted the telegram with hands that Clara noticed were perfectly steady, despite the extraordinary circumstances. As he read the brief message, his expression shifted from concern to something approaching amazement. "What is it?" Clara asked. "It's from Senator Morrison, the real Senator Morrison, not our friend with the rifle," Silas replied, holding up the telegram so the others could see the official seal. "According to this, the senator received a communication yesterday from someone claiming to have evidence of systematic corruption involving federal land grants in Montana Territory. Someone who signed the message, a friend of David Hartwell." Clara felt her world shift as the implications became clear. Someone else has been investigating the same corruption network. Someone with enough political connections to reach a U.S. senator directly. "More than that," Sarah said, studying the telegram over Silas's shoulder. "Someone who knew about David Hartwell's murder and connected it to the larger pattern of corruption. Someone who's been watching and waiting for the right moment to act." The revelation transformed everything Clara thought she understood about their situation. They weren't isolated fugitives fighting a hopeless battle against overwhelming corruption. They were part of a larger movement, connected to allies they hadn't known existed, working toward justice that might actually be achievable. But it also meant that the stakes were higher than they had imagined. If federal officials were involved in the corruption, if railroad executives were personally traveling to Montana to suppress evidence, if unknown allies were working behind the scenes to expose the truth, then the battle they were fighting was for more than justice for David Hartwell or redemption for Silas McCrae. They were fighting for the soul of the American frontier itself. Morrison lowered his rifle and looked at the approaching railroad executives with an expression that mixed professional assessment with personal anger. So what's the play? We've got federal marshals, railroad bosses, and unknown allies all converging on this ranch. We've got evidence that could destroy half the territorial government and a significant portion of the federal land management system. And we've got about 10 minutes to decide whose side we're really on. Clara looked at the ledger in Sarah Harrison's hands, at the telegram that promised unknown allies, at the approaching riders who represented either salvation or destruction. The choice they made in the next few minutes would determine not just their survival, but the fate of every family that would face the corrupt system they had been fighting. "We're on the side of justice," she said simply, "whatever that costs, whoever that makes our enemy, whatever risks that requires us to take. David died believing that the truth was worth fighting for. I won't dishonor his memory by choosing the safe path now." Silas checked his revolver and moved to stand beside her. "Then let's see how many powerful people we can make very uncomfortable before this day is over." The secret ledger in Sarah Harrison's hands contained the names of every person who had profited from the corruption that killed David Hartwell. In the next few hours, those names would either be exposed to the light of justice or buried forever beneath the weight of institutional power. Clara had made her choice. Now she would discover whether the American frontier still had room for people who believed that right was more important than might. The next hour transformed the McCrae Ranch into something resembling a military command post, with Clara at its center despite her condition. Martha had arranged a series of chairs around the kitchen table, creating a planning space where the unlikely alliance could organize their evidence and coordinate their strategy. The warmth of the kitchen provided a stark contrast to the cold calculations being made around the rough-hewn table. "We need to understand exactly what we're facing," Clara said, spreading the various documents across the table's surface like a general planning a battle. Federal marshals, railroad executives, and territorial officials, all converging here because they believe we have something that threatens their entire network. Sarah Harrison placed her father's ledger at the center of the arrangement, its leather binding dark against the pale wood. This is what they're really after: 47 names, ranging from local judges to federal land commissioners, payment records going back 5 years, totaling more than $200,000, in documented bribes and illegal transactions. Morrison studied the ledger with the professional interest of a man calculating odds. $200,000 buys a lot of influence. It also buys a lot of people who are willing to kill to protect their investments. Thomas returned from his latest scouting mission, his face grim with intelligence that none of them wanted to hear. "The federal marshals have established a perimeter about 2 miles out. They're not in a hurry. They're being methodical, making sure nobody leaves this valley without their permission. The railroad executives are camped at the old Hendricks Place about a mile south. They've got their own security detail, and they're armed for a serious fight." "What about the territorial officials?" Silas asked, his attention focused on a map of the surrounding area that he had spread beside the other documents. "Governor Potts arrived an hour ago with a full escort," Thomas replied. "But here's the interesting part. He's not with the federal marshals or the railroad people. He's established his own position at the crossroads, like he's waiting for something to happen rather than trying to make something happen." Clara felt a stirring of hope mixed with apprehension. If the governor is maintaining independence from the other groups, it might mean he's not entirely compromised by the corruption network. Or it might mean he's smart enough to position himself to benefit from whatever outcome emerges, Sarah countered. "My father always said that Governor Potts was the most politically astute man in the territory. He doesn't take sides until he knows which side is going to win." The sound of approaching footsteps on the front porch interrupted their planning session. Martha moved to the window, her expression shifting from caution to surprise as she recognized the new arrivals. "It's a woman," Martha announced. "Well-dressed, traveling with two men who look like federal agents, but she's walking toward the house like she owns the place and they're following her lead." Clara moved to join Martha at the window, her heart racing as she tried to identify the new players in what was becoming an increasingly complex situation. The woman was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of confident bearing that spoke of significant authority. Her clothes were expensive but practical, suitable for frontier travel but clearly tailored in a major city. "I don't recognize her," Clara said, but something about the woman's manner suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed rather than questioned. The woman's voice carried clearly through the cold air as she addressed the house. "Miss Dawson, my name is Eleanor Blackwood, and I represent certain interests in Washington who have been following your investigation with great concern. I believe we have matters of mutual importance to discuss." Eleanor Blackwood. Clara felt recognition dawn. She had seen that name in David's notes, mentioned in connection with federal land policy and railroad regulation. David had suspected that Blackwood was connected to reform efforts within the federal government, but had never been able to confirm her exact role or influence. "She's the one," Clara said suddenly. "She's the ally who contacted Senator Morrison. She's been investigating the same corruption network, but from the federal level." Sarah Harrison's grip tightened on her father's ledger. "If she represents reform interests in Washington, then she might be our path to legitimate justice. But if she's here to suppress evidence rather than expose it, then we'll know soon enough," Silas interrupted, moving toward the front door. "Miss Blackwood, you're welcome to approach the house for discussion, but understand that we're prepared to defend ourselves if this proves to be some kind of trap." Eleanor Blackwood's response carried a hint of amusement. "Mr. McCrae, if I wanted to harm you, I would hardly announce myself and request a conversation. I'm here because certain people in Washington have grown tired of watching territorial corruption undermine federal policy. I'm here because your evidence, combined with what we've already gathered, could finally provide the foundation for meaningful reform." Clara made her decision with the same swift determination that had driven her to oppose Judge Harrison's corruption. "Let her come in. If she's legitimate, we need her help. If she's not, we're no worse off than we were before." Eleanor Blackwood entered the kitchen with the assured step of someone accustomed to walking into hostile situations and emerging victorious. Up close, Clara could see intelligence in her dark eyes, and the kind of quiet strength that came from years of fighting battles in places where women were not expected to win. "Miss Dawson," Blackwood said, extending her hand with the directness of someone who valued time too much to waste it on elaborate courtesies. "I've been hoping to meet you since David Hartwell's murder. He was in communication with our office shortly before his death, providing information that helped us understand the scope of corruption in Montana Territory." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. David was working with federal investigators? Indirectly, yes. He contacted us through Senator Morrison's office, believing that territorial corruption had reached levels that required federal intervention. His documentation of fraudulent land transfers provided crucial evidence for our ongoing investigation. Blackwood accepted a cup of coffee from Martha, her attention never leaving Clara's face. "His death convinced us that the corruption network was willing to use murder to protect their interests." Sarah Harrison leaned forward, her father's ledger still clutched in her hands. "What kind of investigation? And what authority do you have to promise protection for witnesses?" Blackwood's smile held the kind of confidence that came from holding powerful cards in a high-stakes game. "I represent a joint congressional committee investigating federal land policy irregularities. We have the authority to offer full federal protection to witnesses, to subpoena territorial records, and to recommend criminal prosecution for anyone involved in fraudulent federal land transactions." She reached into her coat and withdrew an official document bearing congressional seals. "This is a federal warrant for the arrest of Judge Marcus Harrison on charges of conspiracy to defraud the federal government. It was issued 3 days ago, based on evidence provided by David Hartwell and corroborated by our own investigation. Harrison's dead, Morrison said bluntly, shot in the head yesterday morning. Blackwood's expression shifted from confidence to sharp concern. By whom? Unknown. But whoever killed him was looking for this. Sarah placed her father's ledger on the table where Blackwood could see it clearly. Detailed records of every bribe, every illegal transaction, every corrupt official connected to the territorial land fraud network. Eleanor Blackwood stared at the ledger as if it were the Holy Grail. "May I examine it?" For the next 30 minutes, Blackwood studied the ledger with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. Clara watched her face change as she recognized names and understood the implications of the documented transactions. When she finally looked up, her expression held a mixture of amazement and grim satisfaction. This ledger contains evidence that could result in the criminal prosecution of 3 federal judges, 2 territorial governors, 14 federal land commissioners, and approximately 30 railroad executives, Blackwood said. It also provides documentation of systematic fraud totaling more than $2 million in illegal federal land transfers. $2 million. Clara felt the scope of the corruption expanding beyond anything she had imagined. David thought, "We were looking at maybe $50,000 in fraudulent transactions." David saw only the territorial level of the corruption. What your investigation uncovered was the foundation of a network that extends throughout the federal land management system. Blackwood closed the ledger carefully, as if handling something fragile and precious. With this evidence, combined with what we've already gathered, we can dismantle the entire network and implement reforms that will prevent this kind of systematic corruption from recurring. The sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop interrupted their conversation. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face showing the tension of a man who recognized imminent danger. "Federal marshals," he announced. "At least 20 of them, approaching fast and in formation. They're not coming here to negotiate." Blackwood moved to the window, her expression hardening as she observed the approaching lawman. "Those aren't legitimate federal marshals conducting a proper investigation. Those are hired guns wearing federal badges, sent here to suppress evidence and eliminate witnesses." Clara felt her world narrow to the essential elements of survival and justice. In her hands, she held written statements from dozens of families who had lost their homes to Harrison's corruption. Testimonies that Martha had helped her collect over the past day, as word spread through the community about what was happening at the McCrae ranch. These statements represented the voices of people who had been silenced by systematic corruption, people who deserved to have their suffering acknowledged and their losses redressed. "Then we make our stand here," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We have the evidence, we have witnesses, and we have federal authority on our side. If corrupt officials want to suppress the truth, they'll have to do it in full view of legitimate federal investigators." Eleanor Blackwood checked her own weapon, a small but efficient revolver that suggested she was prepared for more than administrative battles. "Miss Dawson, I want you to understand the magnitude of what we're about to attempt. If we succeed, we'll expose corruption that reaches to the highest levels of territorial and federal government. We'll bring justice for David Hartwell and dozens of other victims. But if we fail, Clara interrupted, placing a protective hand over her unborn child, then David's death will have meant nothing, and the corruption will continue. That's not acceptable." Outside, the federal marshals had reached the edge of the yard, their weapons drawn and their intentions clear. But Clara no longer felt the helpless terror that had driven her across 200 miles of wilderness. She was no longer a fugitive teacher carrying evidence she didn't fully understand. She was a woman fighting for justice, surrounded by allies who shared her commitment to truth, armed with evidence that could transform the American frontier. and she was ready for the final confrontation that would determine whether courage and principle could triumph over institutional corruption and organized violence. The community testimonies in her hands represented more than evidence. They represented the future of everyone who believed that right was more important than might, that justice was more valuable than profit, and that the frontier could be a place where ordinary people could build extraordinary lives without fear of systematic oppression. Clara Dawson was ready to fight for that future. The first pain hit Clara as the false marshals reached the front yard, doubling her over with an intensity that made her gasp aloud. Martha immediately moved to her side, experienced hands assessing the situation with the quick efficiency of a woman who had delivered dozens of babies on the frontier. "Labor," Martha announced quietly, her voice carrying to the others in the kitchen without alerting the men outside. "Early, but not dangerously so. The baby's coming, whether we're ready or not." Eleanor Blackwood's training in crisis management immediately took over. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say with the first child," Martha replied, helping Clara to a chair near the kitchen's back window. "Could be hours, could be much faster. Stress and fear can accelerate things considerably." The irony was not lost on Clara. At the moment when she most needed to be mobile and alert, her body was betraying her with the most fundamental of human experiences. But as another contraction gripped her, stronger than the first, she realized that this was not betrayal, but transformation. She was about to bring new life into the world at the exact moment when she was fighting to create a better world for that life to inhabit. Outside, the voice of the false marshal leader carried clearly through the morning air. "This is federal. Marshal William Burke. We have warrants for the arrest of Clara Dawson, Silas McCrae, and Sarah Harrison on charges of conspiracy against the United States government. Surrender immediately, or face the consequences of resisting federal authority." Eleanor Blackwood moved to the front window, her own federal credentials in hand. "Marshal Burke, this is Eleanor Blackwood, congressional investigator. I'm here on official federal business, and I'm ordering you to stand down, pending review of your warrants by proper federal authority." The response came not in words, but in the distinctive sound of rifles being readied for action. Through the window, Clara could see the false marshals spreading out in a classic assault formation, their movements showing military precision rather than law enforcement procedure. "They're not here to make arrests," Morrison observed, checking his own weapon with professional calm. "They're here to eliminate witnesses and recover evidence." Blackwood's federal authority means nothing to men who are already operating outside the law. Another contraction hit Clara, this one accompanied by the unmistakable sensation of her water breaking. Martha immediately began gathering towels and preparing the improvised birthing area, her movements calm despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Silas," Clara managed between waves of pain, "the evidence. Whatever happens to me, make sure the testimonies reach Senator Morrison. Make sure the family's voices are heard." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Silas replied, but his voice carried the tension of a man who understood that he was about to face the most important fight of his life. "Thomas, take Martha and Miss Dawson to the back bedroom. Morrison, you and your men cover the rear approaches. Miss Blackwood and I will handle the front." "No," Clara said, her voice strengthened by determination despite her physical situation. "I stay here where I can see what's happening. This child is going to be born free, and I want to witness the moment when justice finally triumphs over corruption." As if responding to her words, the baby moved decisively within her, and Clara felt the inexorable progression of labor accelerating beyond anything Martha had predicted. This child, conceived in love and carried through months of danger, was determined to enter the world at the moment when that world was being fought for. The false marshals began their advance, moving with the coordinated precision of men who had done this kind of work many times before. But they had not anticipated resistance from legitimate federal authority, had not expected to face professional killers who had switched sides, and had certainly not planned for their assault to be complicated by the birth of a child. Eleanor. Blackwood's voice rang out across the yard with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. By the authority vested in me by the United States Congress, I order you to halt your advance and present your credentials for federal review. Any attack on this house will be considered an assault on a federal investigation and will be met with appropriate force. The false martial leader's response revealed the true nature of their mission. Congressional authority ends where territorial security begins, lady. Stand aside or be considered an enemy of federal interests. Clara felt the baby's head crowning. As the shooting began, the first volley shattered the front windows of the house, sending glass cascading across the kitchen floor where she lay. But instead of fear, she felt a surge of fierce protectiveness that seemed to give her strength beyond her physical limits. "Now," Martha commanded, her voice cutting through the sound of gunfire. "Push now, Clara. Bring this child into the world." As bullets struck the walls around them and men shouted orders in the yard outside, Clara bore down with every ounce of strength she possessed. The pain was overwhelming, but it was the pain of creation rather than destruction, the agony that brought forth life rather than ending it. Through the broken window, she could see Morrison and his men returning fire with deadly precision. Their earlier loyalty to corrupt officials now transformed into fierce protection of the people who had shown them the truth about their betrayal. Thomas moved with military efficiency, his Civil War experience evident in every tactical decision he made. Silas and Eleanor Blackwood coordinated their defense from the front windows, their unlikely partnership representing everything Clara had hoped to achieve: the alliance between local justice and federal authority, between individual courage and institutional power. Another push, another wave of pain and determination, and suddenly Clara felt the baby slip free into Martha's waiting hands. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouted orders, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her child's first cry, strong and clear and utterly alive. "A boy," Martha announced, her voice filled with wonder despite the circumstances. "A healthy, perfect boy." Clara reached for her son with trembling hands, cradling him against her chest as bullets continued to fly around them. He was tiny and red and absolutely beautiful, his eyes already open and alert, as if he was trying to understand the world he had just entered. "David," she whispered, naming him for the father who had died fighting the same corruption that now sought to destroy them all. "Your name is David, and you're going to grow up in a world where justice matters more than profit." The shooting outside was intensifying, but Clara found herself filled with a calm certainty that transcended the immediate danger. She had brought new life into the world at the moment when that world was being transformed. Her son would never know the fear that had driven her across 200 miles of wilderness, would never live under the shadow of systematic corruption that had murdered his father. Because in this moment, surrounded by people who had chosen justice over safety, truth over profit and courage over compliance, Clara knew with absolute certainty that they were going to win. The turning point came when Governor Potts arrived with the territorial militia, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of supporting the false federal marshals, the governor positioned his men between the attacking force and the ranch house, effectively ending the assault through the simple expedient of superior numbers and legitimate authority. Clara, still holding her newborn son, watched through the broken window as the false Marshal Burke found himself surrounded by territorial soldiers whose loyalty belonged to properly constituted government rather than corrupt officials. The shooting stopped with the abrupt finality of men who recognized when they had been outmaneuvered. "Marshal Burke," Governor Potts called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who held genuine power rather than stolen influence. "I have here a telegram from the Attorney General of the United States, questioning the legitimacy of your warrants and ordering a suspension of all federal enforcement actions in Montana Territory, pending congressional review. Eleanor Blackwood emerged from the house, her federal credentials in one hand and her weapon in the other. The combination of legitimate authority and demonstrated willingness to use force made a powerful impression on everyone present. "Governor Potts," Blackwood said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence of the yard. "I'm Eleanor Blackwood, congressional investigator. I have federal authority to detain these men pending investigation of their credentials and the validity of their warrants." What followed was the kind of bureaucratic confrontation that Clara had learned could be more decisive than any gunfight. Blackwood and Governor Potts examined the false marshal's documentation with the methodical precision of people who understood that legitimacy was the ultimate weapon in any political battle. These warrants were never properly filed with the federal court in Denver, Blackwood announced after several minutes of careful examination. "The signatures are forgeries, and the seal is from a territorial court rather than federal authority. These men are impersonating federal officers." Clara watched Burke's face change as he realized that his mission had failed completely. Whatever authority had sent him to suppress evidence and eliminate witnesses, that authority did not extend to surviving exposure by legitimate federal investigation. "You have the right to surrender peacefully," Governor Potts offered, though his tone suggested this was more courtesy than genuine option. "Or you can explain to a federal court why you were conducting an armed assault on territorial citizens while impersonating federal officers." Burke made his choice with the pragmatic calculation of a professional who recognized when a situation was beyond salvage. "We surrender," he said simply, dropping his weapon and signaling his men to do the same. But Clara's attention was already shifting to a more important confrontation taking place at the edge of the yard. Sarah Harrison stood facing 3 railroad executives, her father's ledger held prominently in her hands like a weapon more deadly than any gun. "Gentlemen," Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "I believe you came here for this." She held up the ledger so they could see it clearly. "The complete record of my father's corruption, including detailed documentation of every railroad payment, every bribed official, and every illegal land transfer conducted over the past 5 years." The lead railroad executive, a well-dressed man whose expensive clothes looked absurd in the frontier setting, stepped forward with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of buying solutions to inconvenient problems. "Miss Harrison," he said, his voice smooth with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to negotiations, "I'm certain we can reach an accommodation that serves everyone's interests. Your father's unfortunate activities need not reflect poorly on his family, and there are financial arrangements that could ensure your continued comfort." Sarah's laugh held no warmth whatsoever. "You're offering me a bribe to suppress evidence of the systematic corruption that murdered David Hartwell and displaced dozens of families. You're offering me money to help you continue stealing from the American people. I'm offering you a realistic assessment of your options," the executive replied, though Clara could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "That ledger contains information that could damage many important people who have the resources to make life very difficult for those who oppose them. Then you should have thought of that before you built your empire on theft and murder." Sarah opened the ledger to a page she had clearly marked in advance. "According to this entry, your railroad paid Judge Harrison $50,000 to facilitate the fraudulent seizure of the Morrison homestead. 7 children lived on that property, Mr. Williams. 7 children who were driven into the wilderness in the middle of winter because your company wanted their land." Clara felt a surge of admiration for Sarah Harrison's courage. This was the moment when individual choice determined historical outcome, when personal integrity proved more powerful than institutional corruption. "Miss Harrison," Eleanor Blackwood interjected, moving to stand beside Sarah with the ledger between them. "As a federal investigator, I'm prepared to offer you and your evidence full federal protection in exchange for your cooperation with our congressional investigation. And as territorial governor, Governor Potts added. "I'm prepared to guarantee that any testimony you provide will be heard by properly constituted courts rather than corrupt officials." The railroad executives exchanged glances that revealed the depth of their concern. They had come expecting to suppress evidence through violence or bribery, had not anticipated facing legitimate federal and territorial authority working in coordination. "This ledger will be turned over to federal investigators," Sarah announced, her voice carrying final authority. "Every name will be published, every transaction will be investigated, and every family that lost their home to fraudulent court orders will receive justice." Clara felt her son stir against her chest, his tiny hand grasping at the air as if he was already reaching for the better world they were creating for him. Through the window, she could see the railroad executives retreating toward their horses, their mission failed and their exposure imminent. The false marshals were being loaded into territorial wagons under the watchful eyes of Governor Potts's militia. Eleanor Blackwood was organizing the evidence for transport to federal investigators. Morrison and his men were helping Thomas secure the ranch and tend to the wounded. But most importantly, Sarah Harrison was walking toward the house with her father's ledger, ready to turn over the evidence that would finally bring justice for David Hartwell and redemption for everyone who had suffered under the corruption network's systematic theft. Clara looked down at her son, David Hartwell Dawson, born free in a world where justice had finally triumphed over organized corruption. His father's sacrifice had not been in vain. His future would be built on truth rather than lies, on legitimate authority rather than stolen power. The frontier would be a place where families could build honest lives without fear of systematic oppression. And it would be that way because ordinary people had found the courage to stand up to extraordinary corruption, because love had proved stronger than greed, and because the truth had finally become more powerful than money. Clara smiled as she held her son, knowing that David Hartwell's mission was complete. 6 months later, the Montana Territory bore little resemblance to the landscape of corruption and fear that had driven Clara Dawson into the wilderness. The changes were visible everywhere. In the new federal courthouse in Helena, where honest judges now presided over legitimate proceedings. In the territorial land office, where clerks worked under congressional oversight. And most noticeably, in the small communities where families had returned to reclaim properties stolen through fraudulent court orders. Clara stood on the front porch of what was now officially the McCrae Dawson Ranch, watching her son David take his first tentative steps across the wooden planks while Silas provided steady hands for balance. At 6 months old, the boy showed the same determination that had driven his mother across 200 miles of winter wilderness, the same refusal to accept limitations that had motivated his father to fight institutional corruption. The morning brought news that had become routine over the past months. Another arrest, another conviction, another family compensated for losses suffered under Judge Harrison's corrupt regime. Eleanor Blackwood's congressional investigation had proven as thorough as promised, resulting in the prosecution of 43 federal and territorial officials and the recovery of more than $3 million in fraudulently transferred properties. "Senator Morrison's office sent word yesterday," Silas announced, emerging from the house with a telegram that bore official congressional seals. The Railroad Accountability Act passed both houses of Congress. Every railroad company receiving federal land grants will now be subject to congressional oversight, and any future fraudulent land transfers will trigger immediate federal intervention. Clara accepted the telegram, with hands that no longer trembled when she read official documents. The frightened fugitive who had collapsed in the snow outside this very house had been transformed into someone that territorial newspapers called the schoolteacher who changed America. She found the title somewhat embarrassing, but she couldn't deny that her investigation had catalyzed reforms that extended far beyond Montana Territory. Martha appeared in the doorway, her arms full of linens that she was taking to the new schoolhouse. that had been built at the crossroads 3 miles south of the ranch. What had begun as Clara's informal teaching of ranch workers' children had evolved into something far more significant, a territorial demonstration school where innovative educational methods were being developed and tested before implementation throughout the American West. "Enrollment is up to 47 children this week," Martha reported, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had helped build something lasting and valuable. "Including 6 from the Morrison family. They moved back to their original homestead after the federal court restored their property rights. The Morrison family." Clara remembered finding their names in Judge Harrison's ledger, remembered documenting their forced removal from land they had legally purchased and improved over 5 years of backbreaking labor. Their return represented more than individual justice. It symbolized the systematic restoration of legitimate property rights throughout the territory. Thomas rode up from the south pasture, his horse kicking up dust from ground that showed the first green shoots of spring grass. His transformation over the past months had been as remarkable as anyone's. From reluctant participant in railroad violence to territorial sheriff, elected by communities that valued his military experience and newfound commitment to legitimate law enforcement. Final court session for the Harrison Network trials concluded yesterday, Thomas announced, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. Morrison, our Morrison, not the senator, got 15 years in federal prison for murder. Burke and his false marshals got 10 years each for impersonating federal officers, and the railroad executives 25 years and full restitution to affected families, Clara finished, having followed every trial with the attention of someone whose testimony had been crucial to multiple convictions. Justice served, finally and completely. Sarah. Harrison emerged from the schoolhouse, where she had been working with Clara to develop curricula that emphasized critical thinking and civic responsibility. The judge's daughter had become one of Clara's closest collaborators, her intimate knowledge of territorial corruption providing invaluable context for educational programs designed to prevent future systematic abuse of governmental authority. Peterson children are reading at a 7th grade level, Sarah reported, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had discovered her true calling. And young Mary Kowalski is showing remarkable aptitude for mathematics. I think she could easily handle territorial teaching certification by the time she's 16. The Kowalski family, the first family Clara had tried to help when she discovered Judge Harrison's corruption. Their daughter Mary was now one of the brightest students in the territorial demonstration school. Her quick mind and fierce determination reminiscent of her parents' refusal to accept injustice without resistance. Eleanor Blackwood arrived, as she had every month since the trials concluded, her visits serving both to monitor ongoing reforms and to maintain federal oversight of territorial governance. But Clara suspected that Blackwood's regular appearances also reflected genuine friendship, forged through shared danger and common purpose. Congressional appropriations have been approved for territorial school expansion, Blackwood announced, accepting coffee and settling into one of the porch chairs that had become the informal meeting place for what territorial newspapers called the Reform Coalition. 12 new schools, with federal funding for teacher training and educational materials. The Montana Territory model is being studied for implementation throughout the West. Clara watched her son take 3 confident steps before sitting down. Abruptly, his face showing more determination than disappointment as he prepared to try again. The sight filled her with the same quiet satisfaction she felt when watching former homesteaders return to reclaimed properties, when seeing honest officials take positions once held by corrupt appointees, when reading letters from families whose lives had been transformed by the systematic restoration of legitimate governance. The new school building rose from the valley floor like a monument to everything they had fought to achieve. Its solid construction spoke of permanence and investment in the future, while its large windows symbolized the transparency and openness that had replaced the secretive dealings of the Harrison era. Most importantly, the school represented hope, the conviction that education and civic engagement could prevent future corruption by creating citizens who understood their rights and responsibilities. "There's something else," Blackwood said, withdrawing an official document from her traveling case. "The President has authorized the establishment of a permanent federal integrity office for territorial oversight. The position of territorial coordinator has been offered to someone whose qualifications include direct experience with corruption investigation, demonstrated courage under extraordinary circumstances, and proven ability to work with diverse groups toward common goals." Clara understood immediately what Blackwood was offering: the opportunity to make her work official, to transform her experience fighting corruption into a federal position that could prevent similar systematic abuse throughout the American territories. It was an honor beyond anything she had imagined when she first discovered Judge Harrison's fraudulent court orders. But as she looked around the porch at the people who had become her family, Silas, whose redemption had been as complete as it was hard-earned, Martha and Thomas, whose loyalty had proved stronger than fear, Sarah, whose courage had matched her intelligence, Eleanor, whose federal authority had provided the framework for lasting reform, Clara realized that she had already found her true calling. "I'm honored by the offer," she said finally, "but my place is here, building something that will outlast all of us. This school, this community, this demonstration that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they choose courage. Over comfort, that's my federal service." As the sun set over the Montana Territory, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Clara held her son while surrounded by the people who had helped transform a landscape of corruption into a foundation for justice. The territory that had once been ruled by systematic theft and violence was becoming a place where families could build honest lives, where education was valued over exploitation, and where the law served all citizens rather than powerful interests. David Hartwell's mission had been completed, but more importantly, his legacy would continue in the classrooms where children learned to think critically, in the courtrooms where honest judges ensured equal justice, and in the communities where people had learned that civic engagement was the price of freedom. Clara smiled as she watched her son reach for the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, knowing that he would grow up in a world where reaching for impossible things was not just permissible, but encouraged.